Today is September 25th, 2023. Let's talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Let's take a look at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It's a pro-Ukrainian map. And I'm showing you a pro-Ukrainian map because I want to show you that even a pro-Ukrainian map is admitting that there is no progress with this ongoing offensive that began in early June, is now toward the end of September, that is almost 4 full months of fighting, and they still have made no progress, even according to the pro-Ukrainian map. So if we zoom in on the primary axis of the current offensive, we see that Ukrainian forces are supposedly still fighting around Verbove. They claim that they have Robotyno. Unfortunately for them, occasionally, even on this pro-Ukrainian map, you will see red rifle icons. The red is Russian-held territory, and the red rifle icons outside of that near Robotyno means that Russian forces are counter-attacking, which means that Ukraine's very meager advance, they began here, they're now here. They were supposed to get all the way down here to the coast, the Sea of Azov. Even their very meager gains are still being contested by Russian troops in the area. Elsewhere along the line of contact, you see no Ukrainian gains at all. As a matter of fact, again, even this pro-Ukrainian map shows these red rifle icons indicating that Russian forces are on the attack, even though this is still technically Ukraine's big offensive unfolding, which we were told by all sorts of Western sources and Western government officials and Western military leaders, that this offensive is not over. It's going to continue well into the winter, possibly into next spring. And this is simply because they refuse to admit that the offensive has failed. It is very clear that it has failed. Ukraine has suffered huge losses. I will get into that a little bit more here in just a moment. To make up for the actual reality, the United States is promising these ATACMS missiles. We've not really gotten an official announcement about this, but it appears that someone somewhere said that Ukraine will be getting at least some ATACMS missiles. They will have cluster warheads rather than a unitary warhead. These are practically useless against hardened targets, which is what the ATACMS would have been used for. Long-range strikes on protected targets. We have this from the Washington Post, September 22, 2023. U.S. will send Ukraine long-range missiles after delay. After nearly a year of rebuffing Kiev's pleas, the Biden administration intends to provide a cluster bomb variant of the Army tactical missile system, ATACMS, which would enable strikes further into Russian-held territory. And actually, not really. It would allow Ukraine to carry out the same sort of attacks that they're already carrying out with their Storm Shadow and Scalp air-launched cruise missiles. We can see that that is having no actual impact on the overall fighting. Neither will the ATACMS. The Washington Post continues. It says the Biden administration plans to provide Ukraine with a version of ATACMS long-range missile armed with cluster bomblets rather than a single warhead, according to several people familiar with the ongoing deliberations. The cluster-armed ATACMS, with a range of up to 190 miles, around 300 kilometers, depending on the version, which means there are other versions that have a much shorter range. Which ones will Ukraine be getting? We don't know. Could allow Ukraine to strike command posts, ammunition stores, and logistics routes far behind Russian front lines and dug-in defenses. And again, because it is a cluster munition rather than a unitary warhead, it'll be less effective hitting any of these targets. The Washington Post continues. It says, as of the end of August, the Army had 1,486 ATACMS in its arsenal, 1,122 with unitary warheads, and 364 armed with cluster munitions, according to information it provided to lawmakers. ATACMS are still in production, with Lockheed Martin under contract to produce 500 a year, but all are designated for overseas sales, so none for Ukraine. So out of all the 1,486 ATACMS the U.S. Army still has, that they could potentially transfer over to Ukraine. Only 364 are armed with cluster munitions, which are the ones they claim they're planning to transfer over to Ukraine. That is a very small number of missiles to select from to transfer over to Ukraine. The Washington Post also says Colin Kahl, who served as the Pentagon's Undersecretary for Policy until early July, I guess he saw a sinking ship and decided to leave, said at a think tank forum later that same month that the arrival of those weapons lessened the need for ATACMS. And they're talking about the air-launched cruise missiles, Storm Shadow and Scalp from the UK and from France. Ukraine's biggest problem, he said, is not 100 kilometers away. It's 1 kilometer in front of them with the minefields the Russians have laid, along with rows of trenches and tank traps and defensive formations along the 600-mile front line. The minefields have proved a significant obstacle to Ukrainian advances, especially in the southeast, where Kiev's forces hope to punch through Russian defenses and cut supply lines. Amid the counteroffensive's slow progress, the British Storm Shadow and French Scalp cruise missiles have allowed Ukraine to attack targets it has been unable to reach on the ground. U.S. officials have said that long-range capabilities are not a silver bullet to solve Ukraine's problems, even as they acknowledge their usefulness. And it's somewhat true that these long-range weapons are not going to help Ukraine amid its current offensive. They already have these air-launched cruise missiles. They clearly have not helped them in this offensive. Something like the ATACMS would most certainly be useful as part of an offensive, but you would also need all of the other components necessary for a successful offensive for this to work, and they don't. So even with the ATACMS, they still lack air power, sufficient artillery support. They don't have enough armor. They don't have enough infantry at this point. Everything has been wasted. So the ATACMS arrive, it is not going to give them the advantage that I think some people hope that it gives them. Now, the Washington Post says the U.S. manufactures ATACMS at around 500 missiles a year. They admit that those are all headed to foreign customers around the world. But let's just say all 500 missiles are going to Ukraine. Let's just pretend that all 500 missiles went to Ukraine. And let's just say Russian air defenses are only 75% effective. That means only 125 of those 500 missiles are actually going to make it to their targets. And I'm just putting that out there so people can put into perspective how little difference this is going to make, even if they were to get 500 missiles, which they aren't. They're not going to get 500 missiles. Far from it. You have to remember that these missiles may be taken out while sitting in a warehouse by a Russian missile strike before they even reach the battlefield. They can miss because of Russian jamming. Just to remind people, this is what happened with HIMARS guided rockets. They have a range of about 70 kilometers. Here's CNN. Russia's jamming of US-provided rocket systems complicates Ukraine's war. This will be in the video description. You could read all about how Russia was jamming the HIMARS guided rockets and how ineffective they became. Which doesn't mean that they're useless, but they're much less effective than I think a lot of people imagined them to be. And because they're not arriving in much larger quantities, when you put these two things together, it makes them useless for Ukraine, essentially. That yes, they can have tactical successes, but it will not shape the battlefield strategically. And the same goes for these ATACMS, the same goes for the Storm Shadow and Scalp, and the same will go for the German Taurus air-launched cruise missiles, if and when they send those. And then even if these ATACMS reach a target, say the Black Sea Fleet headquarters building in Crimea, and it's a cluster warhead, is going to do much less damage than a unitary warhead would do. And as many people have pointed out, including Alexander Mikurs of the Duran in several recent videos that he's done on the topic, the command structure of the Black Sea Fleet in any time of conflict is not going to be sitting in their offices in that building. They're going to be in protected bunkers in different locations. They're going to move around a lot. And this is exactly what the Ukrainian command structure also does. They're not going to be sitting in their symbolic headquarters where they know they're vulnerable to these long-range missiles that they most certainly know Ukraine possesses and can use. As far as the ships of the Black Sea Fleet, because this is what we keep hearing, they're going to use ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Scalp, Taurus missiles. They're going to use all of these to wipe out Russian military capabilities in Crimea. Anything that is in reach of these missiles is going to be either protected or moved. The ships of the Black Sea Fleet, except for the 2 that were in dry dock, they're well out of range of these missiles. They're firing, their contribution to the special military operation is launching Caliber cruise missiles. They have a range of up to 2,500 kilometers, well out of the range of anything that Ukraine is receiving or will receive. So let's keep all of those facts in mind as we continue hearing talk about the ATACMS and also now the Taurus air-launched cruise missiles from Germany. Keep all of that in mind. Ukraine is not going to receive nearly enough of them to make any sort of difference strategically. They will have tactical success to a point. Strategically, no. Let's move on to this. I thought this was a very interesting interview. This is from The Drive, The War Zone, exclusive interview with Ukraine's spy boss from his DC hotel room. Lieutenant General Kurlo Budanov opens up about the ongoing counteroffensive, attacks inside Russia, warnings about Abrams tanks usage, and much more. It's a very interesting interview. Again, the link will be in the video description below. I suggest that you read the whole interview. And if you read it carefully, you will realize that Budanov is saying that Ukraine has no way of winning. They have no way of winning this conflict. They are going to lose. That is basically what he's saying, although he doesn't say it directly. If you parse what he's saying carefully, that's what it means. So in regards to the US-made M1 Abrams main battle tanks that are on their way to Ukraine, only 31 of them. Again, what difference is 31 main battle tanks going to make no matter how good they are? This will make no difference, but they're not that great. They're not invincible. They will burn just like the German-made Leopard 2 tanks and the British-made Challenger 2 tanks. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of similarities between these 3 main battle tanks, the same doctrine, but all 3 of these tanks were meant to serve the same sort of doctrine, Western NATO style of combined arms warfare. The interviewer asks Budanov about the Abrams tanks, and this is what he says. Will they make a difference given all these factors and given the difficulty of maneuvering in mud? Because they're talking about the upcoming rain and the mud that comes with it. And Budanov says they should be used in a very tailored way for very specific, well-crafted operations, because if they are used at the front line and just in a combined arms fight, they will not live very long on the battlefield. They need to be used in those breakthrough operations, but very well prepared. And I'm certain that that is how the British-made Challenger 2 tanks were being used, and yet they are also being destroyed. Budanov continues, he says, currently all main instances of fighting are done on foot without using any materiel. This is linked to the high saturation of artillery systems on the forefront and also portable anti-tank weapons. So he's talking about how the M1 Abrams is coming, but it doesn't matter because we're not able to use armor even if we had large amounts of it. It's useless in this type of fighting. This is what he's saying. And he says this is true for both sides. Those armored systems are not enough to create a gap and the orbits of the enemy to create a powerful breakthrough as in classic doctrine. But it is well enough to deter any attempt of the enemy of any side to conduct that breakthrough with materiel and convoys. Also, there's a high level of saturation with both anti-personnel and anti-tank minefields. Anti-tank mines are making a lot of difference because when such a mine goes off on their wheels, it completely destroys the wheels, and that piece of material is not able to move any further. Damage done to a piece of equipment is minimal, but it still cannot move any longer. Those anti-tank mines are a big problem for those tracked vehicles, and a new feature that hasn't been observed anywhere before in the high number is the high number of first-person video suicide drones on both sides, which are able to engage practically any piece of equipment. All of those above-mentioned factors reduce the possibility of using armored equipment in practically all of the main directions to the minimum. Now that hardware is only used for evacuation or to swiftly transport infantry teams to a particular spot, but it doesn't take part in the fighting. Very interesting. And what he's pointing out is something that I don't hear a lot of Western analysts mention, is that all of these things that they're always talking about that Ukraine is using, like these first-person video drones, suicide drones, you always hear about Ukraine using them, but these analysts never mention the fact that Russia also has them in equal or greater numbers. So this is something that Bunanov is admitting in this interview. So he's saying Ukraine is using infantry on foot to advance on the battlefield. He claims that Wagner did the same thing in taking Bakhmut. He admits that Wagner took Bakhmut, and he said they did this by going in on foot, not using armor. But he said something that is crucial to understand. He said, when they did manage to take Bakhmut on May 21st, they were not using armored vehicles. They were only using artillery support to infantry actions on foot. So practically, they were just using infantry, but with artillery support. That is the key there. They were using artillery support, and Russia has more guns and they have more ammunition to provide that type of artillery support for the infantry as they took Bakhmut or as they undertake any operation on the battlefield along the line of contact. So then he goes back to talking about the ongoing offensive. He says, regretfully, I don't possess precise numbers of our casualties. I find that hard to believe. You're the head of military intelligence and you don't know even your own casualties? That's very unlikely. And then he continues, he says, but it is completely logical that all of our casualties, both killed in action and wounded in action, went up as we shifted to offensive operations, if we compare those with the previous periods. But there is still this very interesting peculiarity that even though we're on the offensive, our numbers of casualties are still lower than on the enemy side who are in defense. And this is complete nonsense. I don't even think that he believes what he's saying. He's admitting that Ukrainian casualty numbers have gone up significantly. And if you remember, when Ukraine was on the defensive in, say, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Kiev itself admitted that they were losing 200 to 300 dead every single day. So if that's the losses of Ukraine on a single front per day on the defensive, and the number has only gone up, there's absolutely no way that Ukraine is losing fewer troops on the offensive against Russia than Russia is losing. And I want to point this out. This is Media Zona. It was put together by a US-backed opposition, anti-Russian opposition group. This is titled Russian Casualties in Ukraine, Media Zona count updated. It was updated last 22nd of September. And if you go down here, they have a graph. They have a graph from the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022 all the way up to September. And as you can see, in the beginning of the operation, there were a large amount of casualties. Between, say, August of last year and around May, June of this year, casualties were quite high. That coincides with the fighting over Bakhmut. And since then, and since June, early June, when the Ukrainian offensive began, Russian casualties have been dropping. They're almost at their lowest point throughout the entire period of fighting. There was only this other period over here where fewer casualties were recorded. And I think as time goes on, unless and until Russia goes on the offensive, again, as they did in Bakhmut, if they repeat that, this is going to be the lowest amount of casualties. And that is in the middle of Ukraine's most elaborate, largest, most concerted attempt at launching an offensive to take territory from Russian forces. So that is nowhere close to true. This myth that somehow Ukraine's casualties went up, but they're still losing fewer than the Russians. Even US government-backed anti-Russian opposition groups on their media projects like Mediazona are saying otherwise. So in this instance, Budanov is clearly distorting reality with this claim that Ukraine is inflicting more casualties on Russia than Ukraine is suffering. And then he says, but having described the overall realities of our current situation, we're smoothly coming to the conclusion that we will have to change something. So if you're launching this offensive, you've shifted your tactics so you're not losing as much armor, you're killing more Russians than you are losing your own troops, what do you need to change? You're wearing down the Russian forces. Surely you will prevail if you continue to do this. But he's saying something has to change because he realizes that the offensive is actually failing, that these myths that he's repeating are not true. He continues and he says, the conclusion is that we'll need additional weapon systems and capabilities that could still change the balance we have today. Because looking at the situation solely from the perspective of manpower, if we compare the Ukrainian potential with Russian potential, the Russians have a lot more human resources. That is why we cannot keep on fighting just soldier on soldier. This will not deliver the results we want. So if both sides realize infantry supported by artillery is the way to go, Russia has the advantage because they have more infantry, and they will always have more infantry. So Ukraine needs weapon systems that can tilt the balance in their favor. That's what he's saying. We also need to resolve the issue of increasing numbers of overall artillery barrels on the battlefield. And we need longer range weapon systems in order to engage their command posts, their logistics, storages, etc., etc. So using armor is out of the question, not that they have a lot of that to spare anyway. Ukraine must use infantry. He's admitting that in order for infantry to be successful, it needs significant artillery support, like Wagner had in Bakhmut, but they don't. They need more artillery. Ukraine does not have enough artillery. This is what he's saying. And as I've pointed out many times before, the West does not have more artillery to give Ukraine. So he says, in order for us to win, we need more artillery. The West has no more artillery to give Ukraine. They're out. They don't have more guns to give Ukraine. They don't have more ammunition to give Ukraine. They will not, for years to come, they will not have more ammunition to give Ukraine. And to make matters worse, I'm going to refresh everyone's memory regarding this New York Times article. Russia overcomes sanctions to expand missile production. Officials say Moscow's missile production now exceeds pre-war levels. Officials say leaving Ukraine especially vulnerable this coming winter. And this was published September 13th, 2023. The article also talks about ammunition production in general. It says that it is 7 times greater than that of the West. It also says Western officials believe Russia is on track to manufacture 2 million artillery shells a year, which is more artillery shells now that Russia is producing than the US and Europe combined will be producing in the future, say between 2025 and 2027, if and when they manage to expand production. So if Budanov is admitting that they don't have enough infantry, they don't have enough artillery, and the West has no more artillery to give Ukraine, what is that? What is the logical conclusion there? The logical conclusion is that Ukraine has no means of winning. They have no way of prevailing. And he is admitting that, again, if you read carefully. Now, he talks about these Neptune anti-shipping cruise missiles. This missile is based on the Soviet-era Kh-35 anti-ship cruise missile. It has a range, the Ukrainian variant supposedly has a range up to 300 kilometers, which would be similar to the ATACMS, the Storm Shadow, Scalp, and Taurus. But the problem is it was still under development when the Russian special military operation began last year. The missiles that they have are basically prototypes. They may have more prototypes on hand that they can use, that they can modify and use. They may have components for building additional prototypes that they're going to be putting together to use instead to hit Russian targets. But they don't have anywhere near the capacity to put it into mass production. It will not be put into mass production, and Budanov even admits this. He says, "We're using everything we have available. The list of various drones produced in Ukraine is quite large now, and we're using everything we can. The Neptune," so he's talking about this anti-shipping missile that they're using now as a general cruise missile, "are in the process of development, which is still ongoing, and they are being improved and improved. But the problem with those is that we don't have the line to produce a lot of them. So the problem is in the quantity of those available." Again, it all comes down to military industrial output and quantities, which favors Russia, not Ukraine, and not even Ukraine's Western sponsors. Then he talks about these drone attacks inside Russia and how they're mostly on civilian/commercial targets. And this is what he says about that. Now, speaking about the strikes deep into Russia, including Moscow, that are conducted by someone, and if you read throughout the entire interview, he's basically admitting that it is Ukraine doing this, and his particular intelligence organization is involved. He says, "There's a social side of it because now the Russian population, and especially large Russian businesses, really start to feel the impact of war. Because before that, it was just a war going on TV. Yes, it did have some financial impact on big players, but smaller ones weren't even touched. But demonstrative strikes, such as strikes against Moscow City, the skyscraper district in Moscow, demonstrates to everyone that now it touches upon them." Then at the end of this The Drive article, this interview with Budanov, they talk about how Budanov is some sort of hero for the Ukrainian people, even after he just admitted that Ukraine is conducting a terrorist operation against the civilian population of Russia, which is exactly what the West accuses Russia of, baselessly. And that is one of the justifications for labeling Russia evil and continuing this proxy war against Russia. This is the head of Ukrainian military intelligence admitting that they are doing in reality what they are accusing Russia of in fiction. So this reflects the absolute lack of values and justification underpinning the West's involvement in this proxy war, their creation of this proxy war. And speaking of a lack of justification and values, let's talk about what happened in the Canadian Parliament. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky traveled to Canada. He gave a speech in front of Canada's Parliament, and then the Speaker of the Parliament had his own comments to make. And as he was talking about World War II, he introduced a World War II veteran. A World War II veteran who he himself said fought the Russians. He's a Ukrainian who fought the Russians in World War II, which means he is a Nazi, very clearly. If you know nothing else about World War II, let's look at Wikipedia. If you know nothing else about World War II, and you just glance at Wikipedia's entry on World War II, you read nothing of the actual article. Forget that. You could spend hours and hours reading all of that. If you just looked at this right here, this basic summary of World War II, and you go down to participants, if you didn't already know this, you see who the main Allied leaders were. It includes Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, which includes Russia, Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, who the Canadian head of parliament actually mentioned and was talking about, and they were fighting against the Axis, which included Adolf Hitler of Nazi Germany, Emperor Hirohito of the Empire of Japan, and Benito Mussolini of Italy. This was the Axis. These were the allies. So if you were fighting against Russia, it meant you had to be at least one of these. And it turned out that this Ukrainian veteran that they then all gave a standing ovation to, turned out that he was actually a Nazi, a literal Nazi, who at one point had to do the Hail Hitler salute to actual Adolf Hitler when he was still alive, either in principle or in person. And I want you to watch the segment of this event, hosting Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. I want you to watch it, see it, and hear it for yourself to truly appreciate what just took place in the Canadian Parliament. And again, it wasn't as if the head of the Canadian Parliament thought that he was a World War II vet who fought the Nazis, and then it turned out later he was a Nazi. He himself introduced him as someone who fought the Russians, which meant he had to have been a Nazi. Let's listen.
Your words today also remind us of another world leader who addressed both our houses during the time of war. In December 1941, during World War II, the British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, traveled to Ottawa and delivered an impassioned speech on behalf of his people to rally for the continued support for his country at war. It was a defining moment of history and one that must never be forgotten. We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98. His name is Yaroslav Hunka. And I was going to say he's in the gallery, but I think you beat me to that. But I'm very proud to say that he is from North Bay and from my riding of Nipissing-Temiskaming. He's a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we thank him for all his service. Thank you.
And then following this section of the speech, he then began lecturing everyone in the Canadian Parliament about Western democracy. And let's be honest, genuine democracy requires an informed electorate. And if the head of the Canadian Parliament is this profoundly ignorant about something like World War II, who the participants were, and he, accidentally invited a literal Nazi into the Canadian Parliament and gave him a standing ovation, what does that tell you about the intellectual capacity of Western leaders right now in the West? And we keep hearing about how Nazis in Ukraine is a Russian propaganda talking point. If you mention this, if you bring this up, you're just repeating Russian propaganda. But we keep seeing these accidents happening over and over again. When the Western media goes into Ukrainian-held territory, they take videos or pictures of Ukrainian soldiers and they're covered in Nazi symbols. And now, what's the chance that you invite a World War II veteran to the Canadian Parliament? It turned out he was an actual Nazi. I mean, what are the chances of that happening accidentally? Unless Ukraine has a serious Nazi problem. And the other thing we always hear is that Ukraine cannot possibly have a Nazi problem because their president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish. Well, let's watch the video again and see what Jewish president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, did when the Canadian head of parliament introduced a World War II veteran who was fighting the Russians. Let's see what his reaction was. Standing and clapping for a literal Nazi. So if you want to know how Ukraine can have a Jewish president and the country still be completely infested past and present by Nazis, that is exactly how, because of the profound ignorance and apathy running across the entirety of the West and their Ukrainian proxies. And then one last article to take a look at before I wrap up this video. Let's look at CBS News. What US taxpayers are getting for their money in Ukraine. This is September 24th, 2023, so just yesterday. And it's all about how people are tired of this war. They're tired of Ukraine. They're tired of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. I think people are starting to get tired of all the scandals and corruption. They're getting tired of Nazis popping up everywhere accidentally. They want money that they pay in taxes to be spent in the United States. That's where it should be spent. This war is a proxy war being waged against Russia for the self-serving interests of Washington and Wall Street. It has nothing to do with benefiting the American people. And so there's articles like this coming out in growing numbers and also videos to try to convince Americans that no, we need to keep pumping money and weapons into Ukraine. Forget about Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Vietnam. Forget about all of these abject failures. This time it's different. I think we can look at what's going on in Ukraine and we can see that it is not different. It is exactly like all of these other conflicts the US has gotten involved in. The US is on the wrong side of history. Canada is on the wrong side of history. The UK, the European Union are all on the wrong side of history. Instead of understanding this, seeing their policy fail in Ukraine, even from a practical point of view, and readjusting their policy accordingly, what they're doing instead is doubling down on the propaganda. So this is going to be a long and painful process. Just like the proxy war in Syria, Russia has proven that it has the patience and perseverance to prevail. They did in Syria, they will in Ukraine, and it's just a matter of us documenting this as it unfolds. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work if you're watching this on YouTube. That includes Telegram, where I post absolutely everything, including things I'm not allowed to post either on YouTube or on Twitter. In the video description below are also all of the articles that I linked to and referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my channels. If an ad pops up, please feel free to skip it. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee or through Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's through one-time donations or donations month to month, even if you're just helping by sharing my work with others, thank you so much. That is what makes all of this possible. And as always, thank you for watching.